Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something pretty wild.
I think so, yeah.
All right, so today we're tackling this this concept, the size-scale theorem, or I've also seen it called the infinite size range theorem.
Yeah.
And honestly, just going through the material you guys sent in, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
Absolutely.
It's not just physics, right? We're getting into philosophy, maybe even a little metaphysics.
That's right, yeah. It's trying to be this really big framework, really redefine how we think about reality, like what is reality?
Okay, so let's break it down.
Okay.
From the top, the core of this thing. I keep seeing this word pillars.
Right.
Like, what are the pillars of this theorem?
Yeah, so you can think of it that way. The first one they talk about is this infinite Sizerange,
Okay.
which basically says reality, the universe, whatever you want to call it, it has no size limits.
Okay.
It's not just that things can be super big or super small.
Right, right.
It's that there is no smallest thing and no biggest thing.
So it's even more than saying, like, the universe is vast.
Yeah.
It's saying that vastness, there's no end to it.
Exactly. There's no edge to it in either direction.
Wow, okay. And then that ties into the second pillar. I see this word,
Yes.
energymass, spacetime, all one word. What is that about?
So this is building off of Einstein, right? EMC.
Sure.
But they're taking it a step further. They're saying energy, mass, space, time. Even these aren't separate things. They're like different sides of the same coin, the same thing.
So no hard lines between them. It all kind of blends together.
Precisely. And then pillar number 3.
Oh, boy.
This is where it gets really head-scratchy.
Okay.
They call it distinction, anti-distinction opposition.
Catchy.
Right. But what it's getting at is the way deepy humans think.
Yeah.
We label things, planet, atom, whatever. That's just how our minds work. But the theorem is saying, at a deeper level, those distinctions, they might not even exist.
So, like, our categories are convenient, but artificial. The universe doesn't care about our labels.
Exactly. And from these pillars, they make some big claims.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
Claim number 1, reality is one thing.
One. Okay.
A single interconnected whole. Everything is part of that energy mass space-time, all blended.
Okay, so I'm seeing how this is different from how we usually think. Like, we break things down into parts, but this is saying it's all
connected, yeah.
one giant system.
And also, claim number 2, it's infinite.
Okay, infinite in what way?
Not just in size, the two, and infinite in its structure. There's no most basic building block, and there's no edge, no boundary to existence itself.
Whoa, that's
yeah.
That's tough to picture. And doesn't that mean, like, we can never really represent this reality?
That's another claim, yep. Unrepresentability.
Yeah.
Every model we make, every diagram, equation, it's just a tiny slice of the whole thing.
And that whole thing is both one and infinite at the same time, which...
Exactly. It's a paradox.
It's like our brains kind of break trying to think about it.
Yeah, our usual logic doesn't quite work here.
But how do they even try to explain this? I'm looking at the source material, and I see some visuals.
Right. They use diagrams, but even those are limited.
Of course.
But it's an attempt, right? One uses these stacked infinity symbols.
Okay.
And it's got EMC socket right in there.
So visually, trying to show that scale, tiny to huge, never-ending.
And that energy mass space-time, it's at the heart of it all.
Gotcha. Any other diagrams that stand out?
There's one that contrasts something called Realm 1.
Realm 1,
Which
right?
is supposed to be like the human mind with its need for categories.
Right.
And they compare that to just reality with a capital R, which is that unified everything.
So showing the difference between how we think and how it really might be.
Yeah, highlighting that gap.
And what about this universal diagram? Metaphysics.
That one's interesting. It puts the quantum scale, human scale, cosmic scale, all on one vertical line, like a spectrum.
So we're not separate from those other scales. We're all part of it.
All connected, yeah. But even with these visuals, it's just a glimpse.
Right. They're limited by their own nature.
Which is the whole point, I think. This theorem is more about raising questions than giving us answers.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is a deep dive and not just a quick dip.
It really makes you re-examine some basic assumptions, for sure.
It does. So, implications time. What does this all mean? Like, why should we care about this?
Well, for science, it throws a wrench into some traditional thinking, like reductionism.
Reductionism being that we can understand the whole by breaking it down to the smallest parts, right?
Right. But this theorem, it's saying the connections between things across all scales are just as important.
So it's not just about finding that smallest particle. It's about understanding how everything relates.
From the tiniest to the largest, yeah. Like they give this example of a leaf falling from a tree.
A leaf. Okay. Now,
I know, right? But it makes sense. Think about it. You can zoom in on that leaf, cells, molecules, atoms, and keep going, theoretically, forever.
right.
And you can zoom out, the tree, the forest, the planet, solar system, keep going bigger.
So the leaf is just this one point on that infinite scale.
And it's connected to everything else on that scale. The tiniest things, the biggest things.
Wow. Okay. And they say this applies to everything, not just a leaf, right?
Everything. They even use temperature as an example. Hot and cold, those are just our categories.
Yeah.
In reality, it's a spectrum. Our distinctions are arbitrary.
So our ways of categorizing, it's just how we make sense of a reality that's way more fluid
Way more fluid, way more interconnected.
than we usually give it credit for.
Exactly. And that leads to some pretty big questions about how we view ourselves, our place in this whole thing.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other conversation.
For sure.
But for now, I think we've at least scratched the surface of what this Sizescale theorem is all about.
We've laid some groundwork.
It's a lot to take in, but it's definitely got me thinking.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah, this gut dive is going deeper. Listeners, buckle up, because in the next part, we're going to see how this affects everything from the idea of God to the future of AI. Stay with us. It's going to get wild.
Absolutely. Okay, so where were we? Oh, right, the Sizescale theorem. One of the things that really jumps out when you start thinking of this is what does it mean for the idea of God?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. How does this fit in with religion or spirituality or any of that?
Well, they talk about this in the sources, this idea of hold on, let me get the term right, non-anthropomorphic
Okay.
rule of God.
Non-anthropomorphic.
Okay.
Meaning not like the traditional image of God, like a human-like being.
Exactly. They're suggesting that God, or the divine, or whatever term you want to use, could be thought of as the very fabric of reality itself, like that energy-mass space-time continuum we were talking about.
So not a separate being who created the universe, but more like the universe itself, is divine.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And it's interesting because this actually kind of lines up with what some mystical traditions have been saying for centuries.
Oh.
Yeah, like the idea that the divine is present in all things, not separate from the world.
So it's less about praying to a God outside of ourselves and more about recognizing that divine spark within and all around us.
Yeah, it kind of flips the whole thing on its head.
That's a pretty big shift.
It is. And it leads to some interesting questions about how we think about different religions, right?
Yeah, like if reality is ultimately one big interconnected thing, does that mean all religions are just different paths to the same truth?
That's a good question. They do touch on that a little bit in the sources.
Okay, what do they say?
Well, they talk about this concept of anti-distinction, remember?
Right.
And they suggest that what we see as separate religions, maybe they're just different ways of experiencing and interpreting the same underlying reality.
So instead of seeing them as competing ideologies, it's more like they're facets of a single diamond, each reflecting a different aspect of the same light.
That's a great analogy. They also point out that, a lot of mystical traditions across different religions, they emphasize this experience of oneness, of transcending the ego, merging with something bigger.
So the Sizescale theorem could be a way to make sense of those mystical experiences, like they're glimpses into that underlying unity of everything.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. Pretty wild when you start thinking about it.
It is. And this whole idea of interconnectedness, it has implications for how we think about morality and ethics too, right?
Right. It's like, if there are no absolute boundaries, does that mean there's no right and wrong? Does this theorem just throw all our moral codes out the window?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, not necessarily. The sources emphasize that the Sizescale theorem, it's not about giving you a specific set of moral guidelines. It's more about encouraging you to see our human concepts of morality as, well, as distinctions, just like the ones we make between hot and cold or planet and star.
So our ethical frameworks, they're just our attempts to map a reality that's operating on a whole other level.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean those moral codes are useless, right? They're still important for how we navigate human relationships and all of that.
So it's not about abandoning our morals. It's about recognizing that they're limited.
And being open to the possibility that there's more to morality than we currently understand.
Right, like our current understanding is just a tiny slice of a much bigger picture.
Exactly. The theorem encourages us to, hold our moral beliefs with a bit of humility and recognize that they're a part of an ongoing conversation.
A conversation that's happening within a reality we only partially grasp.
Yeah, so it's less about following a set of rules and more about acting with a sense of responsibility, compassion, recognizing that our actions have these ripple effects.
ripple effects that go out and affect the whole web of existence.
Right. It's like saying ethics isn't about finding the right answer. It's about understanding the interconnectedness of everything and acting in a way that promotes, harmony and well-being for all.
So every choice we make, no matter how small,
Yeah.
it impacts the entire system.
That's the idea, yeah. It's a big responsibility, but it's also kind of empowering.
It is. And speaking of big things, this interconnectedness, it has some pretty crazy implications for how we think about AI, too.
AI, oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right. So how does the size-scale theorem apply to artificial intelligence?
Well, they suggest that AI systems could be designed with an awareness of their own limitations, recognizing that they're working with these partial representations of an infinite reality.
So instead of trying to create an AI that knows everything, we should be focusing on AI that understands it doesn't know everything.
Yeah, and that it's constantly learning and adapting.
And, I guess, prioritizing the connections between things.
Exactly. They talk about relational reasoning, focusing on the relationships between data points, instead of just categorizing and labeling them.
So it's like teaching AI to think more holistically, see the forest for the trees, instead of getting lost in the details.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a challenge, for sure. But the Sizescale theorem gives us a framework for thinking about how we might develop AI that's not just intelligent, but also wise and ethically aware.
So instead of trying to create AI that gives us definitive answers, maybe we should focus on AI that helps us ask better questions.
Questions that acknowledge the interconnectedness of everything and that push us to explore the universe with a sense of wonder and curiosity.
I like that. But even if we can create wise AI, what about us humans? How do we integrate this concept into our daily lives?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's easy to get lost in the theory, but how do we actually live this theorem?
Yeah, how do we bring it down to earth and make it part of our everyday experience?
Well, they do offer some suggestions in the sources. One thing they talk about is mindfulness.
Mindfulness, okay.
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
Well, in this context, mindfulness means cultivating a deep awareness of the present moment and recognizing the interconnectedness of all things.
So it's about paying attention to the world around us, seeing the beauty and complexity in everything, and appreciating our connection to it all.
Exactly. And it's also about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder, recognizing that we're part of something much greater than ourselves.
Like that feeling you get when you look up at the night sky and realize how vast and mysterious the universe is, and yet we're a part of it.
Exactly. That sense of awe and wonder, it can be a powerful antidote to the fear and anxiety and separation that we often feel in our lives.
So mindfulness isn't just about finding inner peace. It's about expanding our awareness and aligning ourselves with the principles of the Sizescale theorem.
Right. And another practice they talk about is gratitude.
Gratitude. How does being thankful tie into all of this?
Well, in the context of this theorem, gratitude means recognizing and appreciating our interconnectedness with everything. It means being thankful for the air we breathe, the food we eat, the people in our lives.
Even the challenges we face.
Even the challenges, yeah. It's about shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have, from a sense of separateness to a sense of belonging.
And when we cultivate gratitude, we're tapping into that underlying unity of all things.
Exactly. And that can have a ripple effect on how we treat others, how we interact with the world.
It can make us more compassionate, more generous, more willing to contribute to the well-being of the whole.
Precisely. Gratitude and mindfulness, they're simple practices, but they can have a profound impact on our lives and help us embody the principles of this theorem.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this can be more than just an abstract theory. It can be a way of life, a way of seeing the world, a way of being.
It's a shift in perspective, a shift in consciousness.
But it's a lot to take in. And we've only scratched the surface.
We've only just begun.
Listeners, we're going even deeper in the final part of this episode. We'll explore how the Sizescale theorem might help us address the global challenges we face as a species. Don't go anywhere. There's so much more to come. Okay, so we're back for the final part of this deep dive into the Sizescale theorem, and I gotta say, my brain is kind of fried, but in a good way.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is. But we've covered the basics. We've talked about the implications for science, religion, even AI. But now I'm thinking, okay, rubber meets the road, right? How can this theorem actually help us with the real-world problems, the big challenges we're facing?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? Like, does this just stay in the realm of theory, or can we actually apply it?
Right, exactly.
And the source material, they don't pretend like the Sizescale theorem is some magic solution,
Okay.
but it does offer a way of thinking about these problems differently.
Okay, so no easy answers, but maybe a new way of approaching the questions.
Exactly. Like, let's take climate change, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, most efforts are focused on reducing carbon emissions,
Yeah.
which is super important, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
But the theorem suggests we need to think even bigger than that.
Bigger. How do you get bigger than the planet?
Well, not literally bigger. Bigger in terms of our perspective.
Right.
It's about remembering that interconnectedness, we're not separate from nature, we're part of it.
Right.
So it's not just changing our behavior, it's changing our whole understanding of our relationship with the planet.
So deeper than just, like, recycling and driving less.
Yeah, it's more fundamental than that. They argue that this whole environmental crisis, it comes from this worldview that humans are separate from and superior to the natural world.
Right, that we're somehow above it all.
And the Sizescale theorem, it challenges that view head on.
So instead of putting Band-Aids on the problem, we need to go to the root cause.
Exactly, which is this sense of separation.
This us versus them mentality when it comes to nature.
That's a good way to put it. It's about recognizing that what's good for the planet, is good for us, and vice versa.
That makes sense. It's all connected. But, okay, how do we actually make that shift from separation to interconnectedness?
Mm-hmm.
Especially on a global scale, that's a big ask.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. But the source material suggests that maybe the Sizescale theorem itself can help with that shift.
Interesting. How so?
Well, as people start to wrap their heads around this concept, this reality where everything is interconnected, no boundaries, it kind of naturally challenges our assumptions.
Makes you question things.
Yeah, like who are we? What's our place in this? It shakes things up a bit.
So it's about expanding our awareness, seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And hopefully, as that awareness grows, it can lead to a change in values.
Values like what?
Well, moving away from this constant need for more stuff, more growth, more consumption,
Yeah.
and towards a more sustainable way of living, more in harmony with the planet.
Like, once we see ourselves as part of the web of life, we're less likely to want to destroy it. Right.
Right. And this shift in values, it can impact everything, from our personal choices to how our whole society is structured.
Our politics, economics, everything.
Everything, yeah. So it's not just a philosophy, it has real-world implications.
So the Sizescale theorem, it's not just about understanding the universe,
Yeah.
it's about changing it.
That's the hope, at least. And that change, it starts with each of us, right?
Okay, so back to the individual level.
Yeah, as we integrate these principles into our own lives, we become part of the solution.
So walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. Which brings us back to those practices we talked about. Mindfulness and gratitude.
Right.
Those can help us cultivate the awareness we need for this shift to happen.
Mindfulness to see the interconnectedness and gratitude to appreciate it.
Exactly. And as we practice those, we become more aligned with the Sizescale theorem, and we're able to create a world that reflects those principles.
It's powerful stuff. But I gotta be honest, it's also kind of daunting.
I get it.
Like, the problems we face are huge, systemic. Can individual actions really make a difference?
That's where the idea of infinite scalability comes back in. Remember the leaf.
The leaf, yeah.
Just like that leaf is connected to everything else, our individual actions are part of a larger system.
So small changes can have ripple effects.
Exactly. Like a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane on the other side of the world.
Right. Chaos theory, all that.
It's about remembering we're not isolated, we're part of a web.
And our actions have consequences, big and small.
Exactly. So it's not about feeling powerless, it's about understanding that we do have power.
To contribute to positive change.
Even if it seems small.
Even if it's just starting with ourselves.
Right. And as more people get on board with this idea, as we shift our perspective and our actions collectively, well, who knows what's possible?
That's a hopeful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important one is reality is one big interconnected thing.
Not just an idea, but something that affects how we see ourselves, our relationships, everything.
And that understanding can lead to a change in values, moving away from separation towards connection.
From exploitation to sustainability, from fear to love, all those big shifts.
Exactly. It's a new way of seeing the world, a new way of being in the world.
And a new way of creating the world we want.
It's a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity.
So, listeners, Keep exploring this concept. Keep asking questions. Keep looking for those connections that bind us all together.
Yeah, don't be afraid to go down the rabbit hole on this one.
And remember, even in this vast, complex universe, you matter.
Your actions matter.
You have the power to make a difference, to contribute to the well-being of the whole.
To create a more beautiful, harmonious world.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the size-scale theorem.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep exploring all those infinite possibilities out there.
Absolutely.